Beth Osborne joined the U.S. DOT in 2009, worked on development of the Surface Transportation Program's reauthorization, and is currently focusing on the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program. And thank you. You've given us some Tiger dollars in the last 2 or 3 years, and we're spending it as fast as we possibly can. I can tell you that. But before U.S. DOT, Osborne worked for Senator Tom Carper as his legislative assistant for transportation, trade, and labor policy, including work on Safety Lou and the Energy Independence and Security Act. Previously, she served as policy director for Smart Growth America and legislative director for environmental policy of the Southern Governors Association. She began her career in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives, working as a legislative assistant for Representative Ron Klink and as legislative director for Representative Brian Baird. Beth grew up in New Orleans. She's a Southern girl and graduated with a BA and JD from Louisiana State University. And before you talk, y'all have a great day. We're headed up to do a few things. I will just tell you on a personal note, those of you that know Paul Deggs, his father passed away a couple of days ago. And so if you see him, express your condolences. He died of Alzheimer's, and the funeral is this afternoon. We're going to go to that. But thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to spend this morning with you, and I hope you have a great day and learn a lot about transit and transportation when you do let me know, because I'm still learning every single day. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Don't talk yet, Beth. I forgot my phone.
I have to thank the commissioner, not just for his introduction, but for his excellent comments. I don't know about you all, but I was ready to get up and scream hallelujah a couple of times. So I am here to talk to you all about our new reauthorization proposal and how it plays into your priorities and the challenges you're facing in Tennessee. As many of you know, our new reauthorization bill, known as MAP 21, passed in July. And it does 4 main things. It produces funding stability over the next 2 years at current levels plus inflation. It rationalizes the programs at federal highways and federal transit. It expedites the environmental review process, and it introduces performance measurement into our program. Starting with the funding stability issue, people were relieved that they got some stability. Instead of 1 month and 6-month extensions, we got 2 years. Clearly not as good as 6 years, but it's something. And I think what the commissioner was saying is so important about the changing landscape in transportation. It isn't even just the fact that cars are getting more efficient. It goes well beyond that. It includes the fact that people just aren't driving as much. Now, some of that has to do with the economy, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that baby boomers are retiring. They're not going to work. They're moving into communities where they can move around by their own 2 feet. And more importantly, the millennial generation, while it is an increasing part of the overall population, is a decreasing part of the driving population. That has somewhat to do with the fact that millennials are growing up in eras of graduating driver's licenses, things like that, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that they are choosing to live in places where they don't have to spend their lives behind a wheel. And there's a positive side to this funding conundrum. For us to get enough money to fund our program in the past, or with a gas tax, or even a BMT tax, we need people to sit in traffic or drive further. That is how we make our money. That is much the way that we face problems in the utility industry, where they make their money by getting people to use as much fuel as possible. Same thing here. We're getting people to pay for our system by using the system as much as possible and by burning as much fuel as possible. We may need to talk about a way to reverse that and frankly then reduce the burden on our system. The second big thing that has occurred here is the program rationalization. There's a lot more flexibility, and states are more responsible than ever for the expenditure of these dollars. It's really consolidated authority within the states. FHWA, our Federal Highway Administration, which used to have, depending on how you counted it, between 70 and 100 programs, now has really 5 programs. And all of those programs are incredibly flexible. But they're increasingly flexible the more, the better states perform. And they're less flexible the less well states can be able to perform. Some programs you'll be familiar with, like the Surface Transportation Program, is our most flexible program. You can spend that money on anything that is eligible throughout the surface transportation program. The second is the National Highway Performance Program, which is focused on asset management. We have the Highway Safety Improvement Program, focused on safety. The Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, which is focused, as the name makes clear, on congestion and air quality. And the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is the inheritor of the Enhancements Program, including rails to trails, rec trails, safe routes to schools, scenic overlooks, environmental mitigation, and the conversion of abandoned highways into local boulevards. This program will not be strictly a formula grant program. It will be one that NPOs and state DOTs implement by a competitive grant process, and funding will go based on applicants received mostly from local government. The last thing I'd like to mention on the highway side, which is not a funding program, it's still very important, is the establishment of a freight focus. We at DOT are to establish a national freight network that focuses on the most important parts of the freight highway system and the freight network that the shippers use to move freight across the country. And projects that will improve freight movement will be eligible for a higher federal match of someplace between 90 and 25%. So that's going to be an important program, even if it isn't just a strict funding program. On the transit side, the program has been reorganized. There are programs that have been consolidated, mostly the access programs. Instead of having one program for seniors and one program for the disabled, now we're going to look at moving all people who need help getting around outside of a vehicle. We've also established an asset management program and a transit safety program, which is going to be a huge undertaking, one of the Secretary's highest priorities. Additionally, we are continuing, and this happened before MAP 21 and has been continuing through our implementation, to make the New Starts program work better. This involves a couple of things. One is to avoid duplication in the New Starts process. There's been a lot of frustration over the years expressed that we'll have to do an alternatives analysis through our alternatives analysis process, but also through NEPA. We are trying to rationalize that. We are also trying to reestablish all the parts of the law that we are required to evaluate in determining whether a project is ready to move forward or not. Under the past administration, it was focused on cost effectiveness, which had the unintended consequence of encouraging states to do things that, for example, like you saw in Charlotte, North Carolina, where they focused much more on computer rail than on urban circulators, and they built their platforms smaller to keep their costs down to make the cost effectiveness cutoff. But as a result, on day one, their platforms were too small to meet demand. And now we're having to go back and retrofit them, which is much more expensive. We are now trying to establish a New Starts process that looks at all of the benefits of transit, including economic development and mobility, not just the time saving versus the cost, which is what the cost effectiveness looked at. One thing you should be aware of is the New Starts program is smaller than it was. One downside of a formula-based program is all of our stakeholders want to know how much money they're going to get in formula. And when we don't have an increasing pot, it means that the way we ensure everybody is whole is by taking it out of discretionary grant pots. So for example, New Starts has to be smaller to make sure everybody's transit formula grants are big enough. And in highways, all of the competitive grant programs are gone. There were 12, they're now 0. The program did not, the MAP 21 did not include Tiger. It did, however, include a program called Projects of National and Regional Significance. However, it's very different from Tiger. It does not allow localities to apply, and it focuses on projects that are large in size, as opposed to Tiger, which focused on whether or not you're moving forward our strategic priorities of improving safety, economic competitiveness, livability, environmental sustainability, and state of repair. In a state like Tennessee that has a very large program, you would need a project that's half the size of your federal allotment on the highway side each year, which is going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, as opposed to the Tiger program, which really was looking at keeping costs down and encouraging leveraging. But that program, regardless, is going to require Congress to act again. It was authorized in this bill, but it was no money was appropriated towards it. So it's going to require an act of appropriate. And appropriators are considering, because they do have to act for funding, whether or not they are going to maintain all of the requirements of projects of national and regional significance, or whether or not they might adopt some of the characteristics of Tiger. So that is an open question. The last thing I will mention in the reauthorization bill in terms of programs is our financing program, known as TIFIA, was expanded. It was expanded a great deal. And one thing for those who are interested in transit is more and more transit systems are looking at TIFIA as a source for funding projects faster. It can get you funding without going through the New Starts process, quite frankly, though whether or not it's a project that will work, you still need to think through the various things that you would think through in the New Starts process. But TIFIA has been utilized now to fund rail extensions in Los Angeles, in Dallas, in Seattle, and in Denver. And it has been very successful. While TIFIA is normally thought of as a program for toll roads, transit is an area where if you have a dedicated source of funding, or you're looking at using value capture, could be an excellent source of funding. Transit creates, particularly rail transit, creates wealth wherever it touches. We run into problems with it because the second a rail transit line is rumored, developers run in and scramble to take up all the land because they know how much money they're going to make off of it. When you do value capture, you're taking some of that wealth that is generated, putting it back in your system. That can, depending on how it is done, how it is structured, support the payback of a loan to allow you to build that system even faster. So we are encouraging people to come forward with TIFIA, particularly where it might transit. If you're looking for more guidance, you've got questions, we have lots of information on all of these programs online at dot.gov/MAP21. We encourage you to go look at it. There's a huge amount of information there on each one of these programs. The third big thing that MAP21 did was look to expedite the environmental review process, which I know is important to folks. We are going to be providing more categorical exclusions, so you don't have to do a high level of analysis where it is appropriate. We are going to avoid duplication of the process by allowing, in certain circumstances, the final environmental impact statement and the record of decision to be combined, as well as the use of planning documents in the NEPA review. But I want to stress that what your commissioner said goes so much further than anything this bill does in terms of project delivery. That right-sizing approach is the key. Only 5% of projects require a high level of environmental review. It takes up 100% of the focus in Congress, but it is 5% of the issue. 95% of the rest of the projects are CEs right now, and they are not going to be helped by allowing some of the other 5% to become CEs. And even of the projects that have to do an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, the majority of the delay has to do with cost, funding, and local support. What your commissioner is talking about is what is going to address the expediting of those projects. Come forward with your problem, and let's look for the cheapest, most cost-effective, most cost-beneficial approach to solve the problem. This is one of the things that we're focusing on in the Everyday Counts program at Federal Highways, and this is transformative. That is what's going to get projects moving. Instead of having an extremely expensive bypass sit on the shelf for 10 years, 20 years waiting for funding, you can come up with a much cheaper solution that can get done today. The last thing I want to mention is performance management. And this might also encourage project delivery to move a little bit faster. This is probably the most important part of this bill, the most impactful, and unfortunately sometimes the most technical, and therefore the hardest to get people to engage on. The bill sets out a little over a dozen measures. It's very explicit about the measures that they want us to set here at USDOT. And those cover things like asset management, safety, freight movement, air quality, congestion, and overall system performance. Some of them are very familiar to you all. They are bridge and pavement conditions. They are fatalities on roadways. Some are new, but they've been discussed for years, so there's certainly no surprise, like freight movement and serious injuries. Some of them may have been discussed, but how we're going to go about it is much more complicated, like congestion and system performance. The process is going to be that USDOT will set out measures and parameters for these areas and for the reporting on progress. States and MPOs will set targets and report on their progress through their planning process. If sufficient progress is made in these areas, funding flexibility will be brought on. Where progress is not sufficient, funding flexibility will be restricted to focus on those areas. Regardless, we are going to be reporting on what the taxpayer is getting for their investment, and that is going to invite increased scrutiny, but also increased public engagement. Now, why does this matter? The type of measure is not always as easy to find as you might think. In terms of bridge sufficiency, bridge conditions, pavement conditions, we have a long history here. Folks know where we're headed. In terms of congestion or system performance can mean everything and nothing. So what are we going to do? The sort of measure we set could impact what it takes to meet success. I'll give you an example. If you take an approach that's looking at the speed of vehicles on roadways, particularly the speed of vehicles on roadways in non-peak hours versus peak hours, which is much the way the TTI standard looks at it. The roadways that will be the most successful are suburban-style arterials that are focused on high-speed vehicular travel. If your measure is based on something like the number of people moved per lane mile, then the sort of roadway that is most successful is a urban arterial in a more densely populated area that moves pedestrians, bicyclists, buses, streetcars, and vehicles. So the measure is going to matter a lot, because at the end of the day, even if there's not a funding reward or punishment for failing to meet the standard, this is going to go out to your constituents, it's going to go out to the press, and they're going to want to know why you're not meeting these performance measures. And saying that you don't agree with the measure is not going to be a successful or winning argument. So your engagement now on how we set these measures is incredibly important. And we have to move quickly. We're supposed to set these measures within 18 months. And we're supposed to have a 90-day public comment period, which means we have to get these measures out quickly. I think that this is only positive. While it's going to invite increased scrutiny, it is also going to invite increased understanding in terms of the various pressures you all have in meeting all of the challenges and demands on the system. People don't understand our program. They don't. Walk down the street, talk to anybody you know, ask them how much they pay in gas tax. They have no idea. Ask them how much goes to the federal system, where the money goes after it's collected, how it goes out to states and localities, whether it goes out to states and localities, and what is spent on at that point. The fact that nobody knows the answers to those questions is the very reason people don't engage with you all when you're trying to do a good planning process, when you're trying to develop the right project. It's why it encourages NIMBYism, and it also discourages people from being excited about funding the program in the first place. Nobody wants to fund a mysterious program. And when you don't even know how much money is going to the program, it is very hard for people to be excited about putting more money in. So it's going to be accountability and transparency and engagement. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a struggle. But it is going to be an incredible tool for engaging policymakers, other departments and agencies that have responsibility for housing and environmental land use, and the public at large to create a better product and one that has more support overall. So that is the end of my statements. I don't know if we have time, but if there is time, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Beth. This is Ken Moore, and we do have a minute for a few questions, so I'll open that up for the audience. You've done a great job explaining. I see no hands at this point in time.
I have a question.
Okay, I've got a question back here in the back.
If you've got an 18-month period to develop performance measures and the bill is a 2-year bill, it seems like there's a disconnect in how we're going to have any time to implement anything once those performance measures are established. Can you address that at all?
Were you able to understand that, Beth? Obviously not.
Would you mind repeating it?
I'll try to paraphrase if I can. You have 18 months to develop the performance measures, and the bill is only going to be for 2 years. And his question is, how do you implement it in such a short time period? Those performance
Yes,
measures.
That is a question. I completely, I think these are the very questions we're asking internally. I think that the deal is there was no expectation that these performance measures were going to be in full effect by the end of this bill. But when we revisit the bill after it expires in 2 years, this is going to be the structure of this program for the next generation. Much like ICE-T was the structure of the program for over 20 years, we have at least 20 years under this. So we will have a reauthorization bill, but it's not going to be another major restructuring of our program or throwing the performance measures out starting again. This is the first step, and we will revisit in 2 years. And look, even when we didn't have funding problems in the past, it has taken 2 years to reauthorize these bills at least each time. After ICE-T, after T21, after Safety Lou, having lots of extensions is not uncommon. So the idea that MAP 21 would be reauthorized as soon as it expires, I don't think there's any huge expectation there. So we will have our performance measures out before it's reauthorized, and you all will start incorporating it into your planning process, your long-range plans, your tips and stips, and that should be rolling by the time a new reauthorization comes around. And frankly, it might be 2 reauthorizations down the road before we really are in the swing of how performance management works.
Other questions?
Yes, Beth, can you talk a little, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the flexibility now under MAP 21 with regard to surface transportation funds, highway and bridge programs versus transit programs, how you see that flexibility unfolding?
Absolutely. There are a couple things to talk about in terms of flexibility. One is just the vast number of eligibilities that are included in each of the programs. So for example, under the safety program, you can fund anything that is in your highway safety plan. So if Tennessee's biggest problem is seatbelt compliance, you can put your money there. If another state's biggest challenge is distracted driving, they can put their money there. If another state's #1 problem is rural roads, they can put their money there. So it is incredibly flexible in terms of where you can put your money towards safety. Beyond that, there is an ability to flex 50% of each program, of each individual program, from STP to NHPP to the safety program to congestion mitigation, amongst the programs or over to transit. Transit is eligible for funding in almost any of them. Though programs like Transportation Alternatives is very small. It's significantly smaller than Enhancements was. And so while it might be eligible, it's not likely to be utilized in that way. So the flexibility is extreme. It includes flexibility over to transit in many cases. And it's going to be incumbent on you all in your planning process to determine what those local priorities are and to determine where flexing is appropriate for you.
One last question. Anyone? Well, let's give Beth a great hand. We appreciate her. Have a great day, and we appreciate your taking time over Skype, and we'll look forward to hearing from you maybe again in the future.